you know, I'm going to talk about the history of citizen advocacy, which probably means that I'm a bit old, but I do have memories of the early days. I think that we all do better when we know where we come from and what our foundations are. And I believe that citizen advocacy is no different. It's really important to know your history and to know the mistakes you've made so you don't go back and make them again. I'd like to thank people who have helped me gather this information together. I've had lovely chats to people. I've talked to Marg Ward in Queensland. I've talked to Heather Buck in South Australia. I've talked to numbers of people, and people have given me bits and pieces which I've incorporated into my presentation. Now, the other thing about history, of course, is that everyone has a version of history, and I'm giving you my version of history. I'm going to use the language of the day, and I'm going to refer to citizen advocacy programs as against officers, as Zaina said, because the beginning of programs were the things that I'm talking about. And I'm also talking about the practice of the day. Now, just because we did things in a certain way doesn't mean that they were right, but I'm talking about history and I'm giving you that experience. I've also put on the wall some very embarrassing things that we did in the very beginning, and that's really to show you how things started and how things weren't quite right, but we've got ourselves straight in a large degree, I think. So let me begin. As Zaina said, the beginning of citizen advocacy was in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1970, and it was Dr. Wolfensberger who, a decade earlier, was actually influenced by Rosemary and Gunnar Didwab. They were a couple of people who did a lot of work around associations, about groups, and I believe that Wolf was fairly influenced by them, plus the fact that he'd attended that he'd been with that parent meeting of the United Cerebral Palsy Association, where parents actually got together and said, who will take care and interest in my son or daughter when I die? And as a parent, I know that that's a really true question. So it was these influences that led Wolf to develop the advocacy protection schema called Citizen Advocacy in 1968. The schema is based on the premise that people with no human service connections will respond to the needs and protect the interests of people with disability when needed. So this is another very early kind of definition of it. However, the success of the carefully planned and operated early citizen advocacy programs led to over 100 other groups establishing programs, but not enough care and attention was taken to the concepts, principles and the safeguards, and so they failed. And that actually put citizen advocacy, it put it in a very, very vulnerable position, and it was quite a threatened system at that stage. John O'Brien and Wolfensberger got together and they looked at what had worked and what hadn't worked, and it was from that they developed CAPE, the Citizen Advocacy Program Evaluation, which we all use as a foundation today. So we know how important the principles that Zaina talked about are. So, of course, this is the definition that Zaina referred to it, and it was in Nebraska in 1990 that this was made. I do remember, I think it was a half-day discussion, and I think almost every word was agonised over by a group of people in the room. So I won't go through it because Zaina's gone through it. The next definition, which is a much more friendly definition, a shorter definition, is one probably that you're much more familiar with, those of you who work in citizen advocacy. And the last definition that I've put up is one that Nebraska uses, which you can see is a very friendly. It doesn't have all the components of citizen advocacy, but it is a definition that you can talk to people as you introduce them to the notion, because it's about a relationship, about a person who's at risk of social exclusion, in order to represent that person's interests as if they are their own, thus bringing their partners, and that's the word that Nebraska uses, gifts and concerns into circles of ordinary community life. So it's about bringing people to the community and bringing people to a relationship. So that's the very early days. I'm going to now talk about this timeline. And as Zana said, Perth, the Citizen Advocacy Program in Perth started in 1980, Melbourne in 81, and in Parramatta, New South Wales in 82. So I'm going to talk about the program development in the order of commencement. So, of course, first of all was Western Australia. So in 1986, as I understand it, the board of the Slow Learning Children's Group decided to establish a citizen advocacy in Western Australia with a plan for an established program to eventually become independent. The Slow Learning Children's Group formed an interim committee to work on the development of the program. So this is where Pat Brown came in, Mrs. Pat Brown. I don't think I ever met Pat, but I talked to her. She was the coordinator of the support services for the Slow Learning Children's Group, but she was instrumental in the development of the first citizen advocacy program in 1980, as I say. And she continued her involvement serving as a secretary, and I think it was well over 10 years that she was involved in the program. So bearing in mind it started from the service, in June 1983, a steering committee was formed, and it was led by the Reverend Al Good. I did never meet him. To develop a constitution, employ staff, set objectives and source funds. It became known as Citizen Advocacy Perth West, and the first coordinator was Brian Matthews. In 1986, new board members were elected, independent of the Slow Learning Children's Group, and the program was granted short-term demonstration project funding. You'll hear the word demonstration project funding a lot because that's how most of the programs got their first monies. And it was from the Department of Community Services. And this allowed that program to become an independent association. And at that stage, a decision was made to include people with developmental disability as well as people with intellectual disability. So a slightly different focus to some of the eastern states. And in 1990, the program hosted the second citizen advocacy workshop in Perth, attended by people from all states. And that was a fantastic thing because we were fairly adventurous in those early days, as you are for coming here. So we went to Western Australia. We had to wait a year because the airline pilots went on strike, so we couldn't get there. Anyway, we waited the year and then we went to Perth and we had a wonderful time all together. So in 1993, it became evident that there were many people in the wider Perth area that would benefit from a citizen advocate relationship. So that's when Mitchell, who's here, and Miriam Perkins, they were both working in the program at that time, and the decision was made that they would seek community interest in establishing a new program. They worked really hard doing community education, talking to people, sussing out who was interested, who wasn't, and they formed in 1995 person-to-person citizen advocacy Eastern Suburbs. It was a mouthful, Mitchell, it really was. Anyway, the program continued until 2004, when what I say was an ignorant government decision was made to defund the program. It was, you can talk to Mitchell about it, I'm sure he's willing, but it was basically about two citizen advocates being very strong in their advocacy action and one parent complaining, went to the government. The government said, oh, you can't do that, because no one understood advocate independence. However, Miriam continued to work in a voluntary capacity until I think about 2015. And I think she's still in contact with a couple of the advocates of that time. A third citizen advocacy program in Perth called South Metro was also established about the same time, but it's no longer functioning due to poor practice. The other program that started in Perth was in Bunbury, which was south of Perth. That established as a result of a public meeting in 1989. A steering committee was formed and they sought funding and incorporated, and the Citizen Advocacy Southwest started in 1991. And by 1995, they were supporting 28 relationships. And I know that because I was a team leader of their evaluation. So I have that history. So that pretty much sums up Western Australia. I'm now going to go on to Victoria. I apologise in advance because you're getting much more information about Victoria and New South Wales because I've worked in both offices. So in 1976, Ethel Temby, the second woman that Zana referred to, she was awarded a Churchill Scholarship, and she travelled to North America and Europe researching community organisations to support people with disability. Ethel was the mum of a man with Down syndrome, and she had studied. She knew that parents needed to get together, so she started an organisation called STAR, S-T-A-R, in Victoria, which still goes today, with a bit of a changed emphasis, but for many years Ethel was the backbone of STAR and also the backbone of Citizen Advocacy. So around the same time, though, Patricia O'Brien also travelled overseas, and both women were impressed with the opportunities Citizen Advocacy presented. So the first program was under the auspices of STAR in 1981, and it was based at Victoria College with a grant of $6,000 from the Lance Reichstein Charitable Foundation. And as Barbara will tell us, it wasn't a proper citizen advocacy program, and it wasn't. It was advocates they got paid in a way for their advocacy relationship because they were students of special education. Trish O'Brien was the lecturer. She said, if you take an advocacy relationship, you'll get a pass in this particular unit. So you see, advocates were, So that program went for about 3 years, and over the 3 years, there were 50 matches made because the students, of course, thought that it was easier to be a citizen advocate than do the study. Some of those students, though, I must say, are still in relationships. In fact, there's a woman who I talked to ask her if she'd come to the conference. She's known Robin for 40 years. Robin would have been in great trouble without Marcia, absolute great trouble. But she did things like, in the early days of their relationship, she saw that Robin couldn't live with other people. Robin had lots of difficulties in accommodating other people. So she went to the bank with Robin and said, this woman needs a loan to buy her unit. The bank said, she's on a pension, she can't get a loan. So Marcia went from bank to bank to bank to bank, and she eventually got a loan. Robin bought a unit, and she lived there until very recently when her health was failing and she had to move into supported accommodation. So that was just an example of that relationship. So after the 3 years of the program being run out of the Victoria College, Trish was going off to New Zealand to get married, and there was an advertisement in the paper or somewhere, I can't remember, and I think probably Ethel said to me, you should look at this. And so in 1984, I got the job as the coordinator of the program, which consisted of a filing cabinet, and the deal was, take it home, Heather, over summer, and in February you can start work. You've got the job, but we don't have enough money to pay you through summer. And it suited me very well because I had a bunch of small kids. So, it was summer holidays, and I needed a job, so I knew I had a job to go to. So in the very beginning, obviously, getting funding was a major issue. But it was a very positive time because the Health Commission established the Mental Retardation Division. This is the language of the time, remember. And Errol Cox arrived here from Western Australia to run it. Errol was a godsend for citizen advocacy, believe me. Services for people with an intellectual disability were separated from the health budget for the first time at that stage, and MRD encouraged the development of innovative services. As a result, there was great interest in citizen advocacy, and it didn't come from parents, it often came from service providers because they saw it as the best thing. They saw it as a way of helping them out with the issues that they couldn't attend to. So in 1984, there was a steering committee established in the southern region of Melbourne, and it was arranged, the public meeting for that was arranged through an organisation called AMIDA, which was a self-advocacy organisation, wasn't it? Kind of? Kind of? Self-advocacy, yeah. It was the beginning of self-advocacy, I think, when we thought Anyway, Later it became known as Southern Citizen Advocacy. So when the program moved to STAR, it was plain to me that we needed a committee. Barbara had probably told me that we needed a committee. And so we elected, there was a 10-person committee elected, and they were people from the MRD, the Mental Retardation Division, people with disability, citizen advocates and community members, and of course representatives of STAR, because STAR was still auspicing the program. And I worked out of the STAR office. At a later time, when we got a bit more funding, we did change offices. But in the initial stages, I do remember saying to the STAR board, you do need to do something about the rat plague in the offices. It was very basic. But we wrote, Trish O'Brien had actually written an application to the federal government for funding, and it was rejected. But we revamped that and talked about the independence of advocacy. And in 1985, we were given a grant of $67,500, and that was full funding in those days. That enabled us to, the committee and I, to then look at how we would support the relationships, so we did a lot of analysis. We said, where are they? Who are they? And we decided that program needed to be based in the inner east area of Melbourne, because that's where the college was, and that's where a lot of the students were. So that was the birth of Citizen Advocacy Inner East. It supported the original matches, and it ran for many years, and eventually it transitioned into a broader advocacy organisation called MEDA, MEDA. So basically, the interest in citizen advocacy was high, and it was because of the support and the funding promises that emerging groups had. So we had we had a group in Northern, in the Western regions, which Mark was involved in, and we also had a group of people supporting people in Cooloola, which was one of the notorious institutions in Sunbury. This support came from the Office of Intellectual Disability. So this is now OIDS. Bear with me with all these acronyms. It was a new division. It was established really, I think, as a result of the Intellectual Disability Services Act in 1986. And that was a really important act for people with disability, because it brought things to the fore, and it meant that there was some funding around, the government had to honour some of the funding, etc. So in 1986, it also meant that the Citizen Advocacy Victoria Resource Unit was formalised. So I'd been kind of acting as I don't know what, floating around really. But that meant that then there was an actual aim for what we called CAVRU. It was to support and resource existing and emerging citizen advocacy groups, to develop a network and to clarify the principles of citizen advocacy to groups, to government, funding bodies and to the wider community. This was possible, again, we got a grant, our grant was a demonstration project grant. It was also possible, I might add, and I'm sorry for those of you that haven't ever experienced this, but there was a project officer in the Commonwealth Department, and she understood the possibilities of citizen advocacy. She believed that people would say yes when asked. And she went to great lengths to procure and protect our funding. She, in fact, I know, refused a promotion at one stage because she said, no, this is too important a time for citizen advocacy. I'm going to stay where I am. That was a godsend. It was actually in 1986 that I travelled to Georgia. I think that's where I met Barb. I went to Dr. Wolfensberger workshop, and I participated in a program in a Cape. And I was able to spend a day with the Vermont Citizen Advocacy Coordinator. That was absolutely life-changing to me, because for the first time ever, I think I probably started to understand what I was meant to be doing. So when I came back, the funding was still, there was still a lot of activity. And in 1986, the Southern Group was incorporated and received funding from OIDS, Norplan, which is now called North East Citizen Advocacy, Western and Cooloola, now Citizen Advocacy Sunbury, were all made similar progress and employed coordinators. The development, obviously, as we know, of the Sunbury program has a different history to the other programs because it was formed by a group of local people who went into Kalula when there was a staff strike. And they were so horrified with the conditions that people were living in that they actually galvanised interest. And the local Catholic priest was one of the implementers in that. And Kate Kennedy, a number of people got together and Citizen Advocacy was born. So now we have Citizen Advocacy Sunbury. It's now broadened, of course, because when the institution closed, it then had to focus on people from the wider community, so it's now Citizen Advocacy Sunbury and districts. It was an interesting time because Oids actually arranged public meetings in Morwell and Bensdale up in Gippsland. The Morwell group actually formed a steering committee and they were encouraged to appoint a student from the Gippsland Institute to establish the La Trobe Citizen Advocacy Program, which was based in Morwell. It then employed coordinators. So that was an odd way to start a citizen advocacy program, but it ran for a number of years. There was a public meeting in Geelong and they established a committee, and by the end of the year, the Barwon Citizen Advocacy Office had engaged a voluntary coordinator to continue the development of a program. And that was Brian Donovan, whose wife had worked in the services, and he was a voluntary coordinator for a time until they appointed staff. So network meetings continued. We used to meet, I think, 3 times a year. I can't remember really. We made publicity material, some of which is over there. Oh no, none of ours is over there. The really early publicity materials over there, very cringeworthy now. But it shows you the history and how thinking has changed. We also went to Adelaide because that was the very first, it was the first national workshop, that's right, in Adelaide. And an evaluation was held in Inner East. At that stage, John O'Brien had published an evaluation tool called Learning from Citizen Advocacy Programs, some of which is kind of incorporated into valuations using CAPE. But we were testing that. America had tested it and we decided we'd have a look at it as well. So we used that as an evaluation. We didn't continue using that, we kind of reverted back to CAPE. But anyway, by the end of that time, of that year, Barwon and La Trobe had employed coordinators, and that gave us 7 programs in Victoria at that stage. There were over, I think, 250 relationships at that stage, and people started travelling to North America to learn more about citizen advocacy, and programs kept popping up. We then had Zeta came in that year, at 1988, I think, with John Murphy, and we did a national workshop in Melbourne. And we arranged for, against our better judgment, to do 3 CAPE evaluations after the workshop. It was horrendous. But we thought we had to make use of these people from the States, you see, from North America. Sorry, Zane, from North America. So it was a very tough time. By this stage, by the late 1989 to 1990, became quite turbulent at the times. Staff started to leave. People had been working for a time. They decided it wasn't what they wanted to do. And, of course, there was always the threat of funding. Funding was short-term. But then in the state budget of that year, in August, they announced that all funding for citizen advocacy would cease on the 31st of December. Very sensible. At that stage, the Outer East program, which was out in Croydon, out that way, they'd only received funding in the very beginning of that year. So they did negotiate a 12-month extension. But at this stage, everyone was up in arms and, good heavens, okay. And we thought we'd lose funding. However, we fought fairly hard, negotiated a lot of things, and under the Department of Community Services and Health, they commenced a review process under the funding under Section 10 of the Disability Services Act. That was a new act in that year. And eventually it led to programs being funded by the federal government rather than the state governments, and it became a bit safer, but never really secure. The resource unit was threatened in 1991. We were told that we had to reprofile because we had to broaden our focus away from citizen advocacy. So we fought that fairly hard, but it didn't win in the end because probably late 90s, I think, the resource unit was closed, was defunded. There were some other efforts at making citizen advocacy happen, but they were interest groups in Warrnambool. There was an interest group in Stawell, but the Warrnambool group, they were offered money from the government to do a one-stop shop, which was all the rage in that time. So that's what they opted to do. And the Stawell group took funding through a service and decided they'd do citizen advocacy. But of course, that didn't work either. So there we are. So as a result, there was only one. There's only one of the original 9 programs in Victoria that remains, solely focusing on citizen advocacy. So in New South Wales, and I'm saying, Barb, you can't interrupt me because I'm running late, but it was Barbara, of course, who implemented or brought the idea of citizen advocacy to New South Wales. She travelled extensively to North America, and she learnt about citizen advocacy from Wolf Wolfensberger and from, as she said, the Georgia Advocacy and I guess many other places. And she came back, she gathered a group of people together, convinced them it was a good thing to do, and at the end, and was the coordinator, and at the end of that first year, she invited John O'Brien and Connie Lyle to come and do a CAPE on the program, and that convinced the people that it was worthwhile to be done. The success of that program, which was called WestCap in those days, led to requests from for other citizen advocacy programs. And so that program, unfortunately, is no longer running, of course. It had a long history, but it deviated from citizen advocacy, and I understand that it changed its name slightly and then registered as an NDIS provider. So in those days, Citizen Advocacy New South Wales Association was formed in 1983 because of the need for support and efforts to grow citizen advocacy, to protect the practice as well. So it established in 1980, Citizen Advocacy New South Wales established in 1984, and Barbara was the first state coordinator. And again, it had demonstration funding. The initial aims of the CA New South Wales was to establish 2 new programs, one called Newell, which was based in Narrabri, and one called Northwest, which was based in Tamworth. So that was a complicated business because you had to fly to those places because it would take you 6 or 7 hours to drive. So there was a lot of flying involved in that. But Barb got together groups of people in both those areas, and they were funded later. Well, they were funded under the Commonwealth Department of Community Services and Health. You'll notice that the changes of the federal department changes all the time, because not only did they change their name, they changed their colour scheme, and they changed their letterhead. They didn't always fund everything sensibly, but they took care of themselves. It was, government. So the first program in New South Wales, apart from those country programs, was Northside, which was based in Chatswood. It arrived in 1984, followed by Illawarra in Wollongong in 1989, Ride Hunters Hill in 1990, which was based in Eastwood in those days, East Side, which was based in Bondi Junction in 1981, and the last program in New South Wales was City West, which was in Camperdown in 1992. So there were 8 programs plus the State Office. The primary focus of the State Office then moved to supporting the existing programs rather than developing new programs. Okay. The association CA New South Wales was actually an association of the programs, and the programs had representatives that ran the association, just as we did in Victoria, same kind of structure. In 2001, I think I went to New South Wales and became the state coordinator. We invited in 2000, we invited Tom Doody to come to Australia and to lead an evaluation of the state office, which was a very different experience than doing a CAPE, because it obviously had different aims. But we had a team of 6 people who came. The sadness of that is that in 2001, April 2001, the government defunded the organisation, so we didn't ever get a chance to use the benefit from the evaluation. But the claim was that we were not representing value for money because we didn't touch people with a disability on a daily basis. So again, short-term thinking. So now I'm going to talk quickly about the Australian Capital Territory. I don't have much information. I know it started around about 1983, and I think it started out of the Australian Association for the Mentally Retarded, which was AAMR. And I know that in 1986, when Fiona Stewart worked there, it was based in the kitchen of AAMR, so it was not a healthy program. It did have some flourishing times, but then, things went wrong. Board members fell away, staff left, and the program closed. In South Australia, in 1986, again, it was a demonstration grant from a group of people who worked in services, and Des Ford went from New South Wales to South Australia to start that program. So he had experience in New South Wales, so he knew very quickly to establish an independent committee and to find money, to create an independent organisation. He did tell me that there was a lot of conflicts of interest in the first board because there were a lot of service providers involved. So that program, obviously we know that program fairly well. It hosted the very first Citizen National Workshop, and it was held in the Box Factory Community Centre, and I recall it being a very happy time. It was the first time we'd all got to meet each other. It was a friendly thing where we all were eager to work together and to better understand the citizen advocacy model. The outcome of that is there's a letter on the board there. Ethel Temby hand-wrote a 3-page letter to the Director of Disability Programs section of the Department of Community Service and Health, explaining the value of citizen advocacy and expressing our collective concern about the threat to per capita funding. So there's another little joy that we had to deal with. So I guess the story here is that it's never been easy. I don't think I need to talk to you any more about South Australia because you all know Rosie and Heather and other people that are here that I haven't caught up with. The program survives and it's strong. It has had some history of up and down, but I think it's an example of where a board has been strong enough to gather information again and to get the thing started again. So in Tasmania, I have to admit that I think I had to buy a skirt to go to Tasmania because it was explained to me that Tasmania was very quaint and they wouldn't talk to people. They wouldn't take me seriously if I had pants on. So I had to go to Tasmania. So I went there and the department sent me there and said, here's a car, here's your hotels, drive around Tasmania and tell them about citizen advocacy, which I did. I didn't know it not to. But Launceston, a steering group came from Launceston and again has had highs and lows, but it's still there, which is a good thing. Then, of course, Queensland came later because, and I think, that was largely to do with Eric Jones and Jeremy Ward. Eric Jones had worked in New South Wales and he was getting together a bunch of people on the Sunshine Coast. I know that they met for a number of years. They were a diligent group who studied CAPE, who talked about what they were thinking, who they would do citizen advocacy for, and they met in each other's houses over the kitchen table. They usually had a meal and they looked for one-off grants, and they were supported by organisations like the Queensland Advocacy Incorporated and the Community Resource Unit. And I think Speak Up For Yourself, which was SUFI, which was a self-advocacy organisation. They travelled to events like this. They invited people to the Sunshine Coast and they got a program together and started in 1996. And of course, Bob Lee was appointed as the first coordinator. Then we got Brisbane and Rockhampton. Yee. Rockhampton I won't talk about because I think Jenny's going to talk about it, but it had a very good, very complicated start, as did the Brisbane program. I think Jeremy Ward learnt about citizen advocacy in 1984. He knew that he wanted to start a program in Brisbane, and I think it took over. He didn't talk about this immediately, but that group of people met for over 10 years together. Again, often on the veranda of the Ward's house, and they invited people to go. So South Brisbane program started. It was incorporated in 1998, it received funding in 2003, and it opened in 2004, and it closed in 2009 after a very, very fraught time. And the Capricorn program Jenny's going to talk about, there was a program in South Brisbane also, another program in South Brisbane that I understand didn't get funding. I haven't been able to find any information about that. In 2005, of course, the Citizen Advocacy Trust started, and that again was largely the result of Barbara's work and John Armstrong. So the general influences that I think in doing this, it's been quite an interesting thing. First influence was the International Year of Disabled Persons. That brought new awareness and it brought funding opportunities for people. And it was that year that kind of started the interest. And of course, the commitment of Pat Brown, Ethel Tempe and Barbara Page Hannafy, without those three women, we wouldn't be here, I think. The other thing that happened was when the Intellectual Disability Services Act, that changed the political trends. It was also the start of the Public Advocates Office and other kind of advocacies came into being. Travelling to learn was a thing that I believe that, as Zaina said, you can't do citizen advocacy in isolation. You have to talk to friends, you have to talk to people to gather the strength and to maintain your energy. The other influence, of course, is the reliance on government funds. It's been one of the major influences in the practice of citizen advocacy, and I must admit to having been unaware of the implications in the very, very early days of taking easy money, what I call easy money. It's not easy because they keep threatening, but, But I do remember whenever we looked at the CAPE rating, we put it aside on the basis of the argument that people in Australia don't give to charity like they do in the States. We were wrong, but anyway. The last thing, what does this teach us? I think it teaches us, the history teaches us the importance of boards in leading the work, in knowing who to employ and what is happening. Without that, programs find it very difficult to maintain their direction. The other thing is that we all make mistakes. I think we need to understand that. I asked John Murphy when he was retiring, I said, how come you've done this job for so long? And here's a quote, he said, it's all about working hard, keeping your nose down, learning from your mistakes and being open about them, but most importantly, knowing that there is a God and you ain't it. I think it's a good quote. I think it's something that we all should remember. Again, I'm talking about the security and attraction of government funding. It's easier than trying to raise money from the community. Being truthful to the practice, I think that history has demonstrated that deviating from the principles as outlined in CAPE lead programs offline, and they often do more harm to people with disability than good because they promise things that they cannot provide when you deviate to other things. They might be good things, as Zaina said, but, do one thing, do it well, do it small. As doing the commitment to citizen advocacy is, making that commitment with passion and commitment is important. And most of all, treasure and protect and celebrate. There's been 27 citizen advocacy programs in Australia over the years, since 1980, and now there are 8 focusing solely on citizen advocacy model. And we know that there were 1 or 2 in tenuous position, but we also know that there is a bit of interest for new programs, and we are very excited when that happens, believe me. Thank you.